Buenos dias a todos. My name is Kip Daechsel. I am a partner in the business law group here at Dentons, and I am chair of the Latin America desk for Dentons Canada. And on behalf of all of my colleagues, including my partner Ruben Lujan, who's over there, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event today. Con gusto les doy la bienvenida al primer evento del Consejo Canadiense para las Américas en 2020. For those of you who are not familiar with the Canadian Council for the Americas, it is an essential bridge between the Canadian business community and the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. And it's a bridge that our firm very enthusiastically supports. We've been very involved with the Council for many, many years. And in fact, our firm is the law firm in the world that is the most committed to Latin America. We have built a tremendous network of offices throughout the whole region, including in challenging jurisdictions like Venezuela and Argentina. And the objective in doing that is to provide a platform to deliver uniform, coordinated, excellent legal services to our clients, and principally, in our case, to our clients who are based here in Canada. And we have been, as I mentioned, we've enthusiastically supported the Canadian Council for the Americas for a long time. For those of you who aren't familiar with the CCA, last year we had a fabulous year. Now I'm switching hats because I'm also a member of the board of the CCA. And last year we had a fabulous year under the leadership of our chair, Jonathan Hausman, our president, Ken Frankel, and our vice president, Martha Blackwell. And we had such events as a gala for our foreign minister, where she was honored for all of the efforts that she's made to build Canada's role in Latin America. And we had a special event in Mexico City with former Prime Minister Crecha and the foreign minister of Mexico. And this year, we have a very ambitious agenda as well, so please stay tuned. If you're not yet a member, we'd encourage you to consider joining, because, as I say, it's an organization that has the wind in its sails, and we have a lot of very exciting plans for this year. One of the signature events of the CCA is its launch of the year, which is this panel discussion. This is the 10th time that we've done it, and I've had the pleasure of attending all of the events. And as you will see, the discussion is just first rate and gives you added insight into what's happening in Latin America as the year begins. With that, I'll turn it over to our president, Ken Frankel.
Thank you very much, Kip. Welcome, everybody. There are a number of firsts this year, even though it's our 10th annual. And we originally started this as the three amigos, and I can't even remember who the amigos were, but we're up to 5 or 6 of us, and we could go with even more, but we're trying to limit it to this amount. It's the first time that we've live streamed this, and so we know that there are people who are watching throughout the Americas. We apologize to those in the Americas who are not used to starting at 8. We apologize to the Colombians who have already been working for 2 hours, and so, particularly in Medellin, and I know you're watching. But it's also, for those in Latin America who would like to know, it is actually -8 degrees outside here today in Toronto, and so a perfect day to be talking about Latin America. I reviewed last year's event, actually still on our website, I would imagine. And a few things stuck out. One was, nobody really talked about the social upheaval that happened during the last year. And in fact, nobody anywhere was really talking about it. And if you look at the World Bank economic statistics that they projected for 2020 that came in October, they were projecting rates that now don't make any sense based on what's happened over the last month or two. So the difference a month or two can make. I also realized that the level of last year's discourse was maybe the highest we've always had. We always say that, and I was trying to figure out what the secret was to it, and I realized it was because all of the men had grown beards last year, and it was sort of a rabbinical experience, actually. And so I decided to follow suit to see if we can duplicate that. Dan would have had a beard, but he just came back from a weekend of canvassing for Joe Biden in Iowa, for the Iowa caucuses, and so he had to look, he had to look more sort of Midwestern for that. But anyway, thank you. And this is also the first year that Fiona has joined us. She's come from London, and we're very, very pleased that she's with us. So with that, let me just quickly, I sort of introduced people already, but Dan Erikson is the managing director of Blue Star Strategies. He was also the director of Western Hemisphere for Vice President Joe Biden when he was the vice president. Fiona Mackie is regional director, Latin America and the Caribbean for the Economist Intelligence Unit, as I mentioned, from London. John Price, managing director, America's Market Intelligence. I think you were one of the three original amigos, were you not, John? Yeah. Eduardo Suarez, Vice President, Latin American Economics at Scotiabank. He's based in Mexico City, as I should say. Dan is based in Washington, London, Miami, essentially for John. Eduardo, Mexico. And Jonathan Hausman, Managing Director and Head of Global Strategic Relations at Ontario's Teachers Pension Plan. He's based in Toronto, although I think his wife. I was going to say, but his wife wouldn't know that based on he spends most of his time everywhere in the world, particularly a lot of time in Latin America. So I thought the way that we could start this off this year, usually what we do is we ask the panelists to take a half step back and talk a little bit about the previous year. And there'll be plenty of time to talk about the holdover or the recurring themes that started or appeared to start or at least exploded, to use that word, in 2019 and continue on to 2020. But I want to take another half step back and read something that, excerpts that Jose Antonio Campo wrote, who's on the board of directors of the Central Bank of Colombia. He teaches at Columbia University in New York. He has posts for the UN, probably Latin America's foremost economist. And he wrote something that came out only literally 10 days ago. And I don't want to start the conversation reading about this because I want to go back more than just 1 year. I want to go back 5 years. And Jose Antonio says, in the 1980s, Latin America endured a debt crisis so severe that the entire decade was lost to poor economic performance. Since then, other economies, most notably Japan, have endured their own lost decades. But today, it is again Latin America that is facing difficulties. In fact, it has already lost 5 years. Latin America has suffered through a half-decade of anemic growth for the second time since the 1980s, and its lowest performing 5-year period since World War II. In the region's previous lost half-decade, after the 1997 East Asian crisis, the annual GDP growth averaged 1.2%. In 1980 and 1985, the worst 5 years of the debt crisis, the average growth amounted to 0.0%. Over the last 5 years, it reached a mere 0.4%. This is partly the result of an unfavorable global environment reflected in Latin America's deteriorating terms of trade since 2014, the virtual stagnation of international trade overall, and 2 years of renewed financial turbulence in emerging economies. But other developing regions have faced the same external headwinds, and every one of them has outperformed Latin America, not only in the last 5 years, but since 1990, a period during which annual GDP growth in the region averaged 2.7%. And I'm skipping along, but Latin America's economic problems began long before the current wave of economic and political instability. Latin America achieved faster growth, 5.5% average annual rate, in the 30 years that preceded the lost decade of the 1980s, when state-led industrialization was the order of the day, than in the 30 years that followed it. Now I'm just going to finish up with a little bit more. The economic orthodoxy that took hold 3 decades ago derided the state-led approach and urged Latin American countries to undertake market reforms that so far have failed to fulfill their promise. On the contrary, countries' dismantling of their industrial policies, together with the repercussions of the debt crisis, the Dutch disease, effects of the commodity price supercycle after 2003, and rising competition from China, led to premature deindustrialization. Specifically, manufacturing share of GDP has been declining fairly consistently since the 1980s, to the point that current levels are similar to those in the 1950s. While a shift away from manufacturing is a natural upshot of economic development, it began in Latin America at much lower income levels than in the developed countries, making it far more difficult for the region to escape the, quote, middle income trap. Though Chinese demand for Latin American commodity exports has boomed over the last decade, it remains insufficient to offset manufacturing loss. As Latin America enters the 2020s, it must take steps to ensure that the next 5 years are not lost. Yes, the international context will make a difference, but the region's governments have it within their power to improve economic performance significantly. They can foster reindustrialization, including by pursuing greater regional economic integration, thereby supporting intra-regional trade in manufactured goods, and invest in science and technology. Together with active social policies, such growth-enhancing measures can enable Latin America to regain its economic footing and lay the foundation for a better future for its people. Well, it's an interesting way to start off Monday morning, but I think it's a good way to start off this panel. Fiona, would you like to comment a little bit on what Jose Antonio had to say?
Yeah, that's a lot.
Yes.
Just a couple of caveats first. So if I want to be slightly more positive. So if, for example, you take Venezuela out of the numbers for the past 5 years, the growth rate is higher. It's still meh. It's not good. There's still several issues that need to be addressed, but I think we've had a better performance over the course of the past 5 years than maybe is suggested by the article. Also, I think this is key, throughout our discussion today, we need to have market differentiation, right? We have some really bad stories. We have a lot of countries stagnating. We have a lot of countries going back. We also, over the course of the past 5 years, have had a lot of countries that have done well, that have been growing. And I just want to emphasize that not just because for the companies that are here today, you'll want to know about the opportunities, where those countries are. But I think it tells us something about which countries, for example, in 2019, have been most vulnerable to social unrest. So for example, if you look at the past 5 years and you take sort of GDP growth rates per head in the past 5 years versus the 10 years before that, so versus the commodity boom, you can see that a lot of countries are doing really well, right? You can see sort of DOM-REP is up there, a lot of the Central America and Mexico. So again, that need for differentiation. But if we look at the countries that are doing worse, so at the bottom is, of course, Venezuela, followed by Argentina. But after that, the country that has done worse over the course of the past 5 years is Chile, right? So that tells us something about some of the drivers of social unrest that we've seen in 2019. So it's really sort of important to understand which countries are doing well, which countries aren't, and why. So I think it's clear if you look at the past 5 years and if you look at what might happen in 2020 and beyond, as was pointed out in this article, Latin America really suffers from a lack of economic diversification and a dependence sort of on international markets. I think more than any other region of the world, it seems to be a canary in the coal mine anytime something goes wrong. And I think that was really clear, for example, in late 2018, early 2019. So countries like Peru and Chile were getting hit really hard in terms of trade, so in terms of exports, where it wasn't really evident yet in parts of Asia. So they were having this outsized effect from, for example, the U.S.-China trade war. And then going back before that, we had this question of U.S. interest rate normalization and whether or not that was going to cause currency pressures and inflationary pressures in Latin America. And then weakness in the U.S. before that, commodity prices. So there's always something for Latin America in the global economy. Maybe this year it will be Iran and the inflation the impact on oil prices, and for those oil importers, what the impact is going to be on inflation and therefore on monetary policy, right? So there are always complications, and that stems from that lack of economic diversification. So we can talk about this in more depth, but just to wrap up, I'd say sort of to try to interpret what's going to happen next from what's happened in the past 5 years, I like to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly for Latin America. And I think there's some good, and the good is that it is still more resilient to crisis, particularly external crisis. So if you look, for example, one key metric that markets look at to see whether or not there might be sort of currency pressure in future is, for example, the fiscal deficit, but also particularly the current account deficit, right? So if you look at that, generally speaking, there are some outliers like Bolivia, Argentina, but in terms of those external imbalances, we don't see those in Latin America. And where we do see relatively large current account deficits, we see high levels of FDI, right? To sort of offset that, which suggests that we're not looking at external crisis. So that's the good. The bad, I think, is the fiscal situation. We're not looking, in my view, at fiscal crisis for the most part, but there's not fiscal space to address either the demands for expenditure, to boost growth rates in an easy fashion with stimulus, capital spending on the part of the public sector, right? So that fiscal position, which is a lot more complicated now than it was before the end of the global financial crisis, that is at the very least a constraint on growth. And in a few countries like Brazil, potentially the cause of some crisis if really the deficit isn't contained. And then, I would say that the ugly is the politics. And I'm not talking, I want to separate out political instability and political effectiveness. So we measure both at the EIU. And yes, there's been political instability in Latin America, but I would say not much more than some other emerging market regions, where Latin America fares worse than any other region of the world that we cover is in political effectiveness. And that's around issues, partly around sort of corruption and transparency, but it's also just about being able to get things done. So I think that is sort of the nub of the problem in Latin America. So for example, in a country like Brazil, where you have this deep, and there are many other countries in Latin America that suffer from the same thing. So you have this deep sort of fragmentation of Congress, and you can't get anything done. So that has been a source of pork barrel politics and corruption. And even in countries where it hasn't necessarily been a source of that sort of pork and corruption, it's actually just sort of it's produced legislative gridlock, and really that sort of combination of corruption and governments not getting anything done, that's a lot, in my view, of the source of a disillusionment with politics and with government in Latin America that sort of apart from sort of in many countries a weaker economic environment than in the commodity boom has actually combined to produce all the social upheaval that we saw in 2019. So looking ahead to 2020, I would just say, it's the countries that have more space to actually address voter concerns and more effective and efficient sort of public sectors that will be able to sort of produce better results in 2020 and beyond.
Great. Well, I think we can go now. I saw every single head shaking furiously up and down, meaning yes. Jonathan, why don't you?
Yeah, I actually agree very strongly with Fiona on a number of these points. What I'd like to do is take a step back and think about the overall global context for this, maybe we can say unusually poor performance, but nonetheless really not shocking. And also I'd like to address the question of social upheaval and the connection to political ineffectiveness. So I would argue that slow growth and populism and social disaffection and a increasing rejection of democratic forms is an equal opportunity menace. So it is equally true in Arkansas as it is in Chihuahua. So what is this about? What it is about is a fragmentation or a deterioration of a certain moment, which we, of course, all treated as being permanent, but is not permanent, which was really an unprecedentedly halcyon period for investors, for economies on every part of the scale. And it was a moment, it was not permanent. It was a moment that started in the 1990s and ended with a crash in Lehman. And so Latin America is not any different than that. What I think is true is that the running start that countries like the United States and UK had, which might prevent them from becoming even more complicated political environments, that running start's not there in LATAM, and most of LATAM. And I agree with you, we can't generalize. There are very, very significant distinctions between these countries. But on balance, it is not a surprise that there is a real growth of disaffection with democratic forms. So one thing I always want to leave the crowd with, which I think is really important, is that we have generally been brought up to believe that as the middle class expands, which it has in the last 11 years, it has grown by 10% of GDP, of the population of the country, from 25%, I'm including Venezuela here, to 35% of the population. At the very same time, the commitment to or satisfaction with democracy has dropped from 48% in favor, 51% not feeling so great in 2010 to 2018, 71% not happy, and a mere 24% in support. So that tells you something. It tells you the same thing that it tells you that Trump is likely to get reelected, is that among people...
You didn't hear that, did you hear that?
Sorry. But
Covering my ears.
I'm only here to call the game, not to play it. But among people who are not within those, 1%, or within the people who have accumulated wealth, which unfortunately most of LATAM is even more unequal than the United States or even China, there has not been any progress over that period. Actually, very little progress. And I see this as part of that phenomenon, as much as it is a unique phenomenon regarding LATAM.
Thank you. Eduardo, in particular, we were definitely going to come back and talk about the political components and even break it down country by country and see if there are patterns. Eduardo, do you want to talk about it from the economic perspective?
Sure. Yeah. This stock stability that Latin America has been stuck on for the last decade, I think, it has two root causes which have never been addressed and are critical. The first one is education. Latin America has massively underinvested in education, which has limited its growth potential. If you, for example, look at the PISA tables for the OECD where they do the exams, it almost looks like the area code page of a phone book, where you have all the top countries that have done very well in Asia, and Latin America is literally the bottom of the pile. Without a much more serious effort on that front, Latin America will suffer from chronic slowdown. The second one is savings. The two countries in Latin America that save the most, Chile and Peru, are the ones that consistently save the most. But then it gets more nuanced, and if we start having a better story within a mediocre one. For example, if you look at the savings issue, it's not that long ago that in Latin America there was no credit. I was working in the finance ministry in Mexico when the first bond was issued in 2002. Before that, whoever wanted to issue a loan, if government debt in local currency, it doesn't go beyond 3 months, 91 days. How do you get a mortgage? Since then, with the pension reforms that were happening in the region, we now have credit. The problem there is that we have winners and losers. There's a middle class that's doing much better and have access to growth, to loans for houses, loans for cars, and those are the winners. On the other side, you have a massive area of people who are excluded, and that comes back to Jonathan's point. Within Latin America, you have states within countries that have been growing at rates that look like you're in Asia, 6-7%, and fragments of the country are growing very fast. Those are the countries that have access to better education, the parts of the countries, better credit, and they grow much faster. And then you have areas which are excluded from this. And thus, on average, the countries may look like they're stagnating, but really you have winners and you have losers, and that's, I think, the good news for this panel, that within Latin America, you still have markets which are very attractive, which are growing very fast. The problem is those countries haven't been able to make that good story permeate across countries. And to be honest, there's very few countries where efforts on the savings and education have been done to broaden them, and that's the bad story.
John?
We're obsessed with GDP growth, and that's sort of the metric we measure economies around the world. But to simplify it, GDP is just two things: the number of people working multiplied by how productive they are. The number of people working in Latin America has generally been growing very strongly over the last 20 years as family sizes went from 4 to 2 and women joined the workforce. Now going forward, Latin America is the fastest aging population in the world. And the amount of people, the fastest aging, not the oldest, the fastest aging. And so the number of people entering the workforce in Latin America over the next 20 years the rate of increase will strongly diminish. So therefore, Latin America has to depend upon improving its productivity. This is where I have huge disagreements with Ocampo's prognosis, because Latin America was making great reforms up until the 90s. As soon as life got easy, commodity prices went up and interest rates went down, and we had a decade of easy economics in Latin America where even a Kirchner could make the economy grow. All efforts, all the political capital, expensive political capital that's needed to push through difficult reforms, nobody bothered to spend it. And so the reform movements in all the major economies stopped dead in its tracks. And we haven't really had much of a reform movement until very recently, again in Latin America. So, and this idea that somehow manufacturing, I mean, he sounds like Donald Trump. This idea that manufacturing is both what's ruined Latin America and is what's going to save it is absolute rubbish. When you take Mexico out of the equation, manufacturing is 12% of GDP in Latin America. That's not going to save Latin America. It's the service economy. It's the service economy that drives Latin America. It's the service economy that has been the bane of its lack of productivity. Why? Because Latin America couldn't absorb new technology into its service economy to improve it, in part because the purveyors of technology didn't want to give it to Latin America for fear of piracy. Well, that's now all gone with cloud-based computing and open source. And it's the telephone and telephone apps that is changing Latin America and boosting its productivity with companies like Uber and Airbnb and Coursera, and they are dramatically changing Latin America right now. And that's actually lifting productivity. But unfortunately, the politicians, just like in the rest of the world, can't keep up with them. I mean, look at the United States. They can't keep up with Silicon Valley. Well, in Latin America, the gap between the political understanding of this trend and the way consumers are adopting it is so vast that we're seeing it not just in a lack of economic policy, which is actually a good thing because they haven't been able to get in front and try to stop Uber or stop Airbnb like places like Germany and other countries. But we're also seeing that, yes, the lack of economic growth is the seed of discontent, but the match, what really infuriates people. In the past, the politicians could control the message, right? They controlled the message on television, they controlled the message in newspapers. So yes, there was rife corruption, et cetera, but you only heard case by case every once in a while. Now it's in your face because of social media, because 200 million Latin Americans have smartphones, and they're the biggest social media consumers in the world. Anything, any untoward action, comment by a politician can be easily recorded and put on the cloud and immediately shared. And this is catching the political class off guard. And this is what's fueling really the discontent, and is also a vehicle of action, right? We saw how what appeared to be sort of anarchy-driven events, the burning of 78 metro stations in Santiago, turned into a peaceful march of 1 million people a week later. Well, that doesn't happen without social media. So again, I think the political class, I think that all this unrest hopefully has a happy ending in the sense that it smartens the political class into better behavior, as it has done around the world. I mean, look at the Prime Minister of Canada and the fact that a photo taken 25 years ago almost cost him the election. And so the political class in Latin America is having to change its behavior, and hopefully the new class of politicians will be smarter. They may also use it as a manipulative tool of their own, as some say Bolsonaro helped win his election because of his WhatsApp campaign. And they're certainly getting smarter about manipulating social media. But for now, I think social media is more of a positive, shining light on dark places in Latin America than it is a great source of manipulation, although that might change in future.
Thank you. Just as a footnote, within the last week, actually, Colombia has banned Uber, which actually it seems to be.
Well, it's been illegal in Colombia all along.
Well,
So we
actually,
have
no.
to sit in the front seat,
One
right?
ministry said it was legal, and the other one said it wasn't.
Right. I mean, when
so
you-
it was a funny situation when you got
Yeah.
into an Uber, and they said you can ride here, but don't let anybody know, and it was sort of a.
Yeah.
But it's expected that, just a footnote, expected that proper legislation will come into effect, and it'll probably come back again. But it was a big issue, actually, and it resonated. But Dan, you want to talk a little bit about?
Oh, sure.
You
Thank
can,
you.
you can come back to Jonathan's comment later. We will talk about
No, I mean, I agree with
About
most
Trump.
of what my fellow panelists have said. I would just say, in a sense, when we call the last decade a lost decade, it's a little unfair because it's a generalization that I think doesn't really capture some of the positive trends that took place in different countries. And I think that if I was to kind of summarize Latin America over the last 10 years, it wouldn't be so much a decline or a treadmill as a roller coaster, right? And there's been a lot of ups and downs. If we were to have this meeting 5 years ago, there were a number of countries that were in the middle of the commodity boom cycle. And another challenge looking at Latin America is it's a roller coaster, and a lot of these countries are on different rides, right? And some have their seatbelts on, and some don't. And so you, as Fiona said at the outset, if you take Argentina and Venezuela out of the regional panorama, it actually gets a lot better. And if you look at countries like Peru and Colombia, there actually has been steady growth over the last several years, and in the Caribbean and Central America as well. And so I think that, in all, this has been it's not all is lost. It's rather the progress has been uneven, and there have been a couple countries that have really undertaken big declines. And then, I think there's essentially, you can make a long list of the unfinished business of the 2010s, but I think the three that I would highlight in terms of Latin America are persistent inequality, corruption, and security. And I think that the anti-establishment political movements that have emerged in several countries, you could look at Brazil, you could look at Mexico, others, are driven by one or two or all three of those elements. I mean, certainly Bolsonaro's victory in Brazil was a product as much about persistent concern about insecurity as it was about inequality, per se. And obviously in Chile, it's really the inequality element that's been driving things. And so looking ahead, I think one thing that we can hope for and work towards is that you can kind of even out some of these wild swings that are taking place. I think that things are looking a little better economically in Brazil. I personally think the jury's still out in Argentina. I'm not necessarily as down on the Kirchner or Fernandez and Fernandez, if you prefer, duo. It'll be interesting psychologically, if nothing else, to see how that pans out. But clearly, there's still a lot of work to be done and a lot of unfinished business.
Well, we'll focus in on each of the major countries a little bit more specifically. I know Fiona loves to talk about Argentina, so we'll definitely come back and talk about that. But everybody on the panel, as we're sort of segueing now from a bit of the view of the last 5 years economically, and then we sort of seem to have segued in because it's hard to segregate that going forward with the political implications or the political underpinnings or of the grievances that exploded last year. I want to sort of bore down on that one on a little bit, and everybody has said this to varying degrees, but it's definitely clear, it would seem, that one of the common denominators in all the protests was equal access to quality health, pension, and education. Right? I mean, you can, and in a lot of these countries, it was a whole grab bag of concerns, right? And so in Chile, it came up that way. The model of, the icon of the Chicago school, right? And then in Colombia, it came up. Obviously, it started different ways. It started in Ecuador in a different way. To what extent it's just coincident that these themes keep coming up in all the countries with variations, as Dan mentioned on the security, and Colombia plays out differently than in Bolivia and other issues. But to what extent, and why is it just a coincidence that these themes have come up pretty much in all of the countries where there's been these uprisings?
No, I don't think it's a coincidence at all. There's a structural problem, which is there's significant underinvestment in these things. If you look at countries of similar GDP per capita, I'm talking about mainly the middle-income countries of Latin America. So take Chile, the darling of investors and political scientists alike. 10% of GDP is devoted to social spending, which is infinitesimally small if you think about it compared to, well, we're sitting in a country that spends well over 35. So the United States spends up to 30. So it is a structural underinvestment. That's the first point. And you can see residents in Mexico as well as Colombia. The second is, and I think John mentioned this, it's a weak administration. And I'm not talking about any particular administration, I'm talking about public administration in general, is weak. And it matters. In a way, it's a signifier of the progress since the beginning of the 1990s, that people of a certain economic condition begin to demand different things. And what they demand are things that enhance their productivity, like education, and prevent their death, like health. Those are the things that we demand. If you are running around, trying to put a roof over your head and food in your belly, you don't worry about those things, but now they do. So that's also, there's a mismatch between the public administration capacity, the capacity to deliver, and the desire and the demand. And the final thing I'd say is that I think that, and I totally agree with John on this, and this is also a global phenomenon, this is a region which has more recently been sort of connected, if you will, and it is in the nature of our political life today that people can organize and can express instantly, and can do so with a device that almost everybody owns. And that, I think, changes the political demand. So we're sort of seeing a stepwise increase in that, and hence that's why we're having this conversation in the same places at the same time.
Okay, so you mentioned structural issues. A few weeks ago, we had the new Chilean economy minister and the trade minister up for private consultations. And it doesn't give away any of private confidences to say what they would say in public, which is, we realized we've focused on the numbers and basically not on the people. Right. And the prescription to get out of that, or so it would seem at this point, is to then just to increase things, right? So health expenditures are going to go, pension by 50% contributions. In health, all these measures now are the major programs are all going to receive much greater cash infusions, which means that Chile's projected growth this year is going to be not in the threes as originally projected, but somewhere in the middle ones, 1 point something or other. John, is that good enough? We can focus on Chile or any other countries, but we'll talk about Chile now for a minute. Is that going to be good enough? I mean, is the structure, is this tinkering with the structure when in fact people want something more than an economy that's essentially controlled by a handful of families, many of which made their money during the privatization decade? Is that going to be enough?
Well, clearly not. I mean, I think, if in the case of Chile, they've done a better job than any country in Latin America at reducing poverty. So yes, it's still an unequal wealth, but actually the Gini coefficient, which is the metric for that, has actually been improving in Chile in recent years. There's all these reasons why Chileans should be proud on paper as to the progress they've made. But if you ask a Chilean, and I have a lot of family in Chile, if you ask a Chilean of upper middle class or upper class stature, you say, okay, it's great that this is a more equal society, and Chileans talk about that. What happens if your daughter comes home with a boyfriend, a serious boyfriend, who's from the lower classes? Are you willing to accept that man into your family? And that's the step that Latin Americans have not crossed. They have not crossed that threshold. They can talk about it, they can be proud of their economic numbers, but socially it's still a divided region. And it's been a comfort zone for many, many years. And I think that, it was commented on the changing attitudes in some of the cabinet members of the Chilean administration from previous ones that had this sort of aloof, elitist attitude to new ones that have a more inclusive attitude. And basically the entire society has to change. Because you can't just sort of say, well, there's these structural problems in Latin America and that's the base root. It is, but it's events that trigger things. And the two events in Chile that really triggered things, one was a case of collusion where companies were fixing prices on medicines, and the other was a case where they're fixing prices of all things on toilet paper. And so the metaphors are endless there. But the point being that collusion in Chile is not a criminal offense. It's a civil offense. So there was $1 million fine slapped on these companies when they were making tens of millions of dollars in these price fixing schemes. And this was brought to light. And so when you have the problem with the Piñera administration was when they got elected back, they thought, oh, that's a rejection of sort of moving the politics to the left and a more inclusive agenda, which is what Bachelet had. No, it was a rejection of the fact that her son was caught in a corrupt scheme and the fact that her administration was sort of caught flat-footed on a number of issues. Chile is the only country in the world or the next country in the world that will go from the third world to the first world, just like Korea did and like Taiwan did. And when countries do that, if you follow sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's not enough to put food on the table and keep them safe. They aspire for more. And Chileans are aspiring for more. And when you have a government that has a case of collusion where basically they slapped them on the wrist and they took millions from consumers, and then the most venerated institution in Chile, the military, was caught with dozens of senior military leaders. There was a case where they discovered that they had been spending, lavishly on second homes, and their wives going on shopping trips, etc. So here, the most venerated institution in Chile is found to also be corrupt. Those were the slaps in the face that triggered the anger.
Well,
You cannot just rely, it's too easy when you're in New York or Washington to sit back and say, well, the Gini efficient's this way. No, it's the stuff on the ground and the fact that it's immediately in your face through social media that triggers it. What happened in Ecuador, what happened in Bolivia were totally different than Chile. Yes, they all have structural issues, but what happened were events that were exploited on the one hand, and an anger that might have been limited to 3% of the population became 15-20% of the population because of social media. And this is where, on the one hand, there's a certain degree of unreasonable expectations, right, amongst Latin Americans, but there's also this complete lack of consciousness of the political class and the upper classes in Latin America. I mean, they still live behind walls. And even, I spent a week in Brazil over the New Year's with lovely people who are incredibly wealthy, and they talk about, all the wonderful things they're doing for their staff. And they sort of, they criticize the certain things that come out of the mouths of Bolsonaro, but they love the fact that Paulo Guedes is building this economic situation that allows their property investments to rise in value by 10% a year. And it's just, they are not willing to give it up, and that's normal. The British didn't want to give it up either, but the First World War and the fact that the entire working class was killed changed the structure of the British economy and forced rules to take wealth away from them. And this is what we need in Latin America. We need some sort of event. And if it's not going to happen suddenly, it's going to happen through demographics. The fact that it's the fastest aging population in Latin America, in the world, means that 10 years from now, there will be no good help in Latin America. There will be no poor people to wash your dishes because the demographics will change. And the wealthy in Latin America have to wake up and address this, and the politicians have to align with them. And in Chile, I'm actually optimistic that the pragmatism that Chileans have always had will come to influence the sit-down between the left and the right and the citizen groups come this April. And I do believe that they will hash out a new formula that may end up being a blueprint for other countries in Latin America. But that's what has to happen.
Okay, there's a lot there. Yeah, it's true. We have this discussion that there were trigger, however there was, but it's also true that yes, the argument Chile is a victim of its success to a certain extent, is what you're saying, these aspirations. But at the end of the day, the numbers look great, but middle-class people are retiring and get no money to retire on because the pension plan isn't there. A very good friend of mine, a Chilean analyst, private analyst, I suppose, and plays inside politics there. I mean, great metaphor for Chile right now. And he likened it to going to a kid's birthday party. And he said, well, if you go to a birthday party and the tallest kid, and they're playing keep away with the balloon, right, or some game like that, the tallest kid, the strongest kid, which in this case would be the very, very closed economic elite of Chile, they're holding the balloon and they're holding it above everybody's head. Right? And all the other kids are jumping up to try and get it. They want to hold it too and too and too. And he said, if he doesn't give it up and they don't get it, then they'll break the balloon, right? I mean, it maybe could be against their interest, but one way or another, that's something that they want to get their hands on. And if they're not going to give it up, then they're going to make it so that the other guy can't get it. How deep is this, Fiona? Do you see this in Chile as something that's going to be solved with throwing some more money at a pension plan or in a health system or educational system, but the elite, going back to John's point, isn't really going to start to cede a lot of what they're holding on to? Let's start with Chile, or Dan. What are your thoughts about that?
I mean, I have a somewhat optimistic view of Chile, and money is part of it. It does have the fiscal capacity to throw more money at the problem, and that is part of the problem, is spending on social safety net expenditure and redistributing and making expenditure more fair, right? So I think that can be done in Chile. Certainly the public debt to GDP ratio is low. I think it's going to be a process that's going to take a while, right? So I think we're on the right track now. I think it's part of a story of growing pains in Chile, as you said, to move up and out of that middle income trap. And what we see here is people pushing Chile out of that middle income trap. I do have some concerns around the politics, right? Because although we have this capacity in Chile for change, and we also see that institutions are strong, we see this process that's taking place within the context of strong institutions. So that sort of raises some hopes for the Constituent Assembly. But I think what we have is a population that looks at the political class in Chile on both sides, and they're all the same, right? They think they're all the same. The left and the right, there's been this policy consensus, political consensus for decades, and that's only just now disappearing. So the question is, what comes next? What comes after Piñera? So I think some of the right policies are being put in place, and I think, yes, faster growth will help, right? But I think we have to worry about what happens, what comes next after Piñera, and I think that's a big unknown, especially things that we've been talking about, the political earthquakes of 2018, right? What comes next? Could it be a populist, right?
Well, yeah, it's playing a little bit what Jonathan touched on. The concern there is the whole political class in disrepute. So if you have leftists, there's been examples of hallowed figures in the left going out into the streets in Chile and being equally booed and being taunted for what they were. So you're in a funny situation where you sort of want the left is sort of hoping that Piñera continues on at least while there's a void in the left in Chile, and then they can somehow reassemble rather than seeing what the alternative would be. Dan, you just, before you were in Iowa, actually spent a lot of time in Chile and had discussions with government officials. What's your sense of what's going on the ground? And if the vote coming up in April for a new constitution, depending on how that gets voted, how that the Constitutional Assembly will be composed, what is that going to tell us? What's going to tell us about Chile going forward this year?
Well, Chile is still on the roller coaster in 2020. There's no question. And this constitutional reform process has a lot of unknowns. I was in Chile in November, and literally the fires were still burning in some parts of Santiago. And I think that, on the one hand, the Chilean political parties did a very smart and courageous thing by taking that kind of rising public anger and finding a way to channel it into a political process, right? The constitutional reform process, which is going to unfold over the next year and a half. There's going to be a vote for a referendum on whether or not to reform the Constitution, whether to have a constituent assembly or assembly composed of members of Congress and people directly elected to negotiate a new Constitution. Then they need to elect the actual members of this in October. Then they have essentially a year and change to draft a new Constitution. And of course, the challenge for Chile is that there were very immediate social demands that are not going to be addressed immediately through this kind of lengthy constitutional reform process. Also, when you look, and this goes a little bit beyond Chile, but when you look at the triggers, and it goes a little bit to your initial list when you said, why is this all about health and education and so forth? But in a lot of these countries, the trigger for social unrest has actually been around public transportation. And of course, in Chile, it was the metro fare rise in the rate that initially sparked that. You could go back to Brazil in 2013 when there was a rise in bus fares. In Ecuador last year, the fuel price hike. In Haiti in 2018, there's a spike in fuel prices as well. And I think that one of the things that Latin Americans are demanding is a way to get to and from work, school, wherever they want to go in an affordable way and with an infrastructure that can support that. And to me, that's a tremendous investment opportunity throughout the region because there is need for high-speed rail. There is need simply for roads that can help get buses from one place to another. And so I think that's something that leaders in the region are going to have to address. But I would say with Chile, I mean, I have to confess, I left still with a sense of unease. That this really, that they had not quite found their way out of this problem yet, and I'm not sure if the constitutional reform process is going to be able to achieve that, particularly since a lot of the parties that signed on to the document calling for constitutional reform are, of course, opposed to constitutional reform and always have been, and we're doing it under extreme duress, and that's likely, so that sort of agreement to even reform the Constitution in the first place is likely to splinter, I think, in the coming year.
Thanks. So I'm going to go to Eduardo and Jonathan both, because I know you both want to talk about Chile. So for folks in the audience who want or following Chile, for Chile's purposes, but also perhaps as a bit of a harbinger as what may be going elsewhere in the hemisphere, what can they look for? What should they be looking for this year? Obviously, as Dan mentioned, there is the vote in April on the composition of the new Constitutional Assembly, choice either between have a mixed member of current Congress people and citizens, or just all 100% citizens. Eduardo, depending on how that plays out, what should people start to read into that? And I say this with a caveat, knowing that Chile is essentially on vacation now. When March comes around, students start going back, and they have to start paying their school tuition, and people are going to be losing jobs because of the slowdown, because of what's happened with the unrest, and any number of bills that are going to come due. That also could have effect on what gets played out in April. But taking that all into consideration, what should people be thinking about in terms of how they look at Chile?
I think Chile, to some degree, is foreshadowing something that can happen in the rest of the region. We had an eruption in unrest that triggered a lot of problems, which I think is actually a good thing. It's an opportunity because there are root problems that need to be changed, and you need something, as has already been said, that tips a solution. The second thing that happened, I think the diagnosis in Chile and elsewhere is now the correct one. In almost every single country in the region, every single campaign has been about, to different degrees, corruption, inequality, and security. So people now know what's wrong, and the debate has pushed in that direction. So in that regard, Chile and elsewhere, Chile just more advanced in the process, is correct. Now comes the really tricky part, because that has to be solved. And a good outcome in that front comes from first having good information, and second, using that information in the correct way. And then it gets really tricky, and I think that's where the politics makes the whole end of the story be up in the air. Because across the region and in Chile, we're having now in Chile the constitution being debated. In other parts, we have elections, which will essentially be how you address this in a different political way. The debate has to be honest. The Chilean constitutional debate cannot go the way that Brexit did. You cannot have two alternate series of facts being deployed, and that's also true of governments going forward. When you see governments in Latin America being confronted that they're not delivering on these issues, you cannot have what's happening. The politicians say, well, I have alternate facts. I think we're currently in a critical junction. You have already brought up demographics. We have a region that went from having absurdly high fertility rates, 4 kids per couple on average, to only having under 2 kids per couple. This decade is critical. If you have such a big shift, before demographics were a problem, when you have very low women participation rate, and you have an incredibly fast population growth that's adding a 40% increase in your population size per decade, and you have only half of the adults working because women are not working, there's just not enough money being produced by people who are working to solve social issues. We're getting to the point where we're basically a replacement, but coming into a very fast depletion in the population. So now we have the money, because more women are working, the population is growing slower, so you can actually address those needs. So putting all this together, the people are now hungry, they want better distribution, they want better services. Now you have the capacity to pay it, because now you have a much higher share of the population working, and you also have the problem properly identified. This decade, I think, is the one that makes or breaks Latin America. Because if you don't address these issues now correctly, by having an honest and proper debate, and then choosing the right solution, then this thing that we're seeing happening in Chile, which I think is to some degree happening elsewhere, is going to break the whole region.
Thank you, Ed. Jonathan, if the vote in April is to have the Constitutional Assembly composed 100% of citizens, what should people be reading into that vote?
I think we all want to be optimistic because that's a natural state of people who are investing. But I will say I'm a little concerned, particularly in the event of the conditions that you just described, because of precisely what Eduardo said. This is a very jarring change for a region which has had very specific ideas of what leadership is about and very specific ideas about what delivery is about. And now we are really very suddenly thrusting these systems into an entirely different state. And my worry is that in the event that it is a totally citizen-based thing, is that it will become chaotic. And chaos, or as Hannah Arendt put it, thoughtlessness, which is essentially the same thing as it relates to politics, is one of the big check marks for the rise of populism and the rise of anti-democratic or illiberal leadership. And the thing that is haunting the region, in my opinion, is Duterte. Duterte is a perfect example. I can give you 16 others, and one of them is just south of the border. I can give you example after example of where just that kind of chaos, the sense of what do I hold on to? How does this get worked out? We only have 10 years to sort this out. To me, has always led in Latin America to setting aside democratic forms and moving towards more command and control forms, which may seem ironic based on what we're talking about, the demands of a middle-income country and the people who want better things. But you know, what we've seen in small doses in Brazil, what we saw when the military realized they had to land this plane, the entire elite is in jail. The entire economic condition of the country is in the balance. It was essentially a soft coup. It was a very successful soft coup, and it was brilliantly executed through democratic forms. But it was a soft coup. The Turks were like sitting there, oh, I wish we could have done that, you know. But they always messed it up. So that's what haunts this entire. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be seeing the rise of a new Pinochet. I don't believe that for a moment. But I do think, and the most sophisticated analysts of Chile, particularly those who have participated in government, one in particular, has repeatedly said, one, there will be blood in the streets in this country, 2 years ago. And two, the biggest risk to Chile is a return to authoritarianism of some kind, or some hybridized, illiberal, more populist appeal, because people want things done. They want them done now. And the structures that they've been relying on for the last several decades have frankly come up short.
Thank you. Jonathan opened the door to Brazil, and I know we can do a final last quick comment on Chile, or let's just step into the door in Brazil, because we don't have time to cover. Jonathan opened the door to Brazil, as I said. John, why don't you talk a little bit about what you see going on in Brazil over the next year?
So the international press often gets Latin America wrong. I've never seen them so wrong as the way they analyze the Brazilian elections. Bolsonaro was typecast. I mean, they were calling for a coup d'etat in Brasilia within 6 months of Bolsonaro winning the election. They also thought, the international press thought AMLO was the second coming of Christ. So they got it wrong there as well. But the point is that in Brazil, it's not, the parallels with the United States are, they're not just easy, they're actually pretty accurate. But you have a leader who, the difference between, I think, Trump and Bolsonaro is Bolsonaro recognizes that he knows nothing about the economy and has essentially deferred that to Paulo Guedes. And Guedes, who is, turned into more of a political animal than we realized, first of all. But more importantly, people don't quite understand just how anti-PT Brazilians of all economic levels remain. Lula apart, who has his own brand and his own following, but generally there's still, even after Bolsonaro's been in power, I guess almost 2 years now, there's still such discontent with the PT that it provides a political opportunity to pass reforms in Brazil that we have not seen for 40 years. And it's the exact same blueprint of reforms that have been called for in Brazil for a long, long time. And the first big hurdle has been crossed, the pension reform. It was watered down by 30%, but it was enough to keep about $60 billion of hedge fund money inside Brazil. Now they're looking at fiscal reforms. And the thing about fiscal reforms is there's so many moving parts that it will not come out as the idealists would like it to come out. But again, I think there's enough political support in both houses of the legislature to push it forward. And what you see in Brazil is this animal spirit amongst investors. They're at 4.5% Selic rate, the lowest in I don't know how long.
Almost forever.
Investors are very excited in Brazil. And you also see, you've had a series of reforms and concessions in infrastructure and energy that are going to usher in about $300 to $400 billion of investment over the next 5 years in Brazil. And everybody's lining up. So you still have a consumer that is weak, that was so over-indebted and got crushed when the currency collapsed and interest rates went up. That consumer is starting to pay down that debt, but they're not spending yet, and that's why growth is still muted in Brazil. But the investment side of the economy, the corporate sector in Brazil has completely restructured and is healthy again, and you're seeing record profit levels at the corporate level in Brazil. And now you have this investment climate, and supported by a government, albeit saying horrendous things through its leader, but nonetheless, the economic policies are very supportive of investment growth. And I believe that Brazil will outperform its estimates over the next 3 years. And Brazil will be, 3 years from now, will be as it was the big story 10 years ago, will again be the big story and big driver of growth in Latin America. I'm very bullish on Brazil, particularly in energy and infrastructure.
Thank you, John. Fiona, I'm going to come to you now, but I do want to point out in one of the piece of information I gleaned from viewing last year's event was what John said was exactly what you said 1 year ago, Jonathan. So there you go, and you're shaking your head again furiously in agreement. So Fiona, Brazil.
Slightly more cautious on Brazil. I think there's a difference between what happened with the pension reform and what's happening with the rest of the reform agenda. I think we saw that there was a huge, broad consensus around the need for pension reform finally for Brazil to actually avoid some sort of crisis, right? And that consensus we saw sort of the executive at the congressional level, local governments, even the population. So opinion polls suggested that the government managed to sell the idea that, look, we can't spend money on other stuff because we're spending money to pay for people that retire in the public sector at ridiculously early ages, right? So they sold that to the public. There was consensus among pretty much everybody of the need for pension reform. And even then, it wasn't, a totally smooth ride through Congress, And I think the difficulty comes with the rest of the reform agenda, which in certain areas is more controversial for example, ideological reasons or because it affects sort of special interests within Congress or within local governments. So we do think that there will be some progress. There's obviously going to be some privatizations, more along the lines of subsidiaries, because that will not, according to the latest rulings, require sort of congressional approval, right? So there's still, bearing in mind that even just at the federal level, there's 150 state-owned companies in Brazil. So there's a lot, there's a lot of opportunity there. But we are slightly cautious. And then in areas like tax reform, the opening of the economy, it's going to be complicated. And the question that we have is what happens when these reforms run into more obstacles in Congress and particularly among the population. So we know that Bolsonaro has said, I don't know anything about economics, I'm going to let Guedes do it all. But we also don't know that he is that committed to it, right? So if and when things get slightly more difficult, I'm not clear that Bolsonaro will be that supportive of Guedes' efforts to actually make progress on that reform agenda. Having said that, we are, so with those caveats, Brazil is a good news story, particularly for 2020. Looking out into the medium term, we don't think it's going to quite reach 3%. So could do better. But this, as you say, there's, the potential for more progress on this reform agenda than there has been in decades, right? So this is a golden opportunity for Brazil. I think it's going to take some of that opportunity, but I think I just want to sort of, we're a little bit cautious on Brazil.
Thank you. Did you want to say something about Brazil, Dan?
I mean, just very briefly, that I think that when you look at Bolsonaro's record as a congressman, he was actually very statist, right? And he clearly discovered, this whole process of economic reform on the process to the election. It reminds me a little bit of Trump and the evangelicals. We never really even thought about them until he ran for office and got into office and said, all right, turned to Mike Pence, you take this, right? And as Bolsonaro's done with Guedes on the economic piece. But I think that Brazil, there's just decades of red tape, And it's always been, when you look at a couple of years ago in the World Bank's Doing Business report, it was tied with Iran for ease of doing business. I think it's bumped up a couple notches since then. So I think you can't underestimate the challenge of even a very pro-business government.
Just one thing. The government has already pulled back on the public sector reforms that it was undertaking because it is afraid of this sort of social unrest that we saw at the end of 2019 in other countries. So, that will be back on the table, but obviously there are concerns about sort of public approval for the reform process. And again, I don't know that Bolsonaro is necessarily that committed to it if it comes down to, demonstrations in the streets.
Jonathan, you've been remarkably...
Just one thing about Brazil, I can't really help myself.
Actually, you've been remarkably constrained.
We have amazing panelists, as we always do, I guess. But it was one thing that I think is very important from a point of view of framing this phenomenon and looking at 2020 and looking forward for the next, say, 4 or 5 years, maybe even 10 years. I agree there's green shoots, and I think that is our base case, and that likely better performance than the 2.2% that is currently being projected by most of the banks, et cetera. Cumulative effect of all sorts of reforms, including the industrial relations reform, which I think is extremely important to the political economy of Brazil. But I want to say one thing, and that is this, if this is all true, this could inaugurate the first period in Brazilian history when reform is associated with growth. Because reform has always been associated with pain, austerity, and really bad times. And this is associated with growth. And I think that has a huge structural boost for the country in the eyes of investors and in the eyes of its own population. And we can maybe foresee a period where more market-friendly policy is considered to be a smart political thing to do.
Can I just add?
Yeah, no, please.
Really briefly, there's really good research from the IMF on that, on that it matters when you do the reforms, and it matters if you do them in good times or bad. It matters how you coordinate them. It matters whether or not you do structural reforms and at the same time do reforms to, for example, institutions, rule of law, governance reforms, right? So, and you get better results when you reform in good times. And that goes right back to the very first thing that you were talking about in that Ocampo article. So I think that structural reforms, those should not be off the table. That is the key to increasing productivity. It's just how you do them, how you coordinate them. I think what we need to see is more. We need to see more of the structural reforms, but we need to see them alongside sort of governance reforms that make them more successful.
Okay, you just opened the door to your favorite topic. I want to go to questions after this. Argentina,
Yeah.
structural reforms.
Speaking of
Oh,
What have we learned in Argentina?
well, you can't do them in bad times.
And you can't do them in good times.
But you should do them in good times.
Go ahead. This is.
assuming
Go
there are
ahead.
good times.
Hold forth on Argentina. I know you love talking about it.
Yeah,
Go
well,
ahead.
I mean, I know it's the case that unless you're stuck in Argentina at the moment as an investor, you're not going to be looking to invest in Argentina anytime soon, right? So as we saw in Brazil and Mexico, for the first couple of quarters after those political earthquakes, we saw that there was a drop in investment. There were some country-specific idiosyncratic factors, but there's political uncertainty. In Argentina, there's political uncertainty, but it's much worse. We're looking at an economic crisis and the likelihood of default. We've penciled in a restructuring with a haircut of only around 33%. If it happens, it could potentially be much, much more than that. In our view, having spoken to sort of members of government and various analysts there, I think the idea is that the government wants to say that it does not it doesn't want to default. It doesn't want to have a big haircut with the debt restructuring, right? And it also actually wants to take care of the private investors that the Fernandez government says invested in good faith in Argentina, and what it has an issue with is the IMF and the previous government, and that lending program actually was used just to sort of pay off debts and not for productive reasons, and that was a waste of money. So there's going to be a lot of difficult negotiations with the IMF, but the government for now is trying to say, we want to deal with you, the private sector that has invested in good faith. Now, that's all well and good. The problem is that if you don't have the straitjacket of an IMF program, and even potentially if you do, then confidence is not going to come back to Argentina, right? Certainly if you don't have the straitjacket of that program and you don't have the money from that program, bearing in mind that Argentina's external financing requirement is so high, I think it's not going to work. It's not going to work. Perhaps it will work in 2020, but looking out to 2021, 2022, that's really problematic. So we're going to see, and time is short, right? So we've got big payments falling due from April, really. So time is really short. We haven't seen a lot of movement, at least publicly, on the part of the Fernandez administration, either before it came into office during a long transition period, or really it's been sort of eerily quiet on this front. So time is short, so that really raises the risk of some sort of really messy, disorderly default. So that's very high risk in Argentina. Having said that, if we look at the rest of the economy and we look at the fact that a Peronist administration is coming back to power, apart from the fact that you have all of these sort of macroeconomic distortions, there is one thing that the Peronists have, and that is the ability to work with friendly business. So I think there's this idea that maybe like historically, the period Mexico, that the Peronists are the party that can get things done, right? And they're going to get things done, and they're going to get it through a level of sort of micromanagement by talking to people in the business sector, by talking to the unions, by making deals, and assuming that there isn't a disorderly default. In that context, we expect that there could be some sort of modest recovery in Argentina starting in the second half of 2020, picking up some speed into the medium term, but our outlook for Argentina in the context of this administration, we don't think that there's going to be a lot of confidence in rule of law or institutions out into the medium term. And at the same time, we don't think this government is committed, for example, to actually tackling the inflation problem. So we think that inflation might come down to around 20%, but not much less than that. So the competitiveness issues that have been a problem in Argentina for many years now, those are going to reemerge sort of over the course of coming years in our view. So it's that sort of roller coaster. So they're going to be back with that issue of an overvalued currency in the medium term if they don't actually tackle the inflation issue more sort of strenuously than we currently expect. So there's a lot that needs to be done in Argentina, and not a lot of confidence in the government's capacity to do it.
Okay. John, did you, yeah.
Yeah, just for some people in the room and certainly some people listening, I think there's interest in Argentina's mining sector and energy sector. And unfortunately, the Peronists, and it's economic expediency, but they reinitiated a lot of the export taxes on agricultural goods pretty much right away. I'm not sure if any decisions have been made around taxation on future vaca muerta, production. That's something that one has to look out for. And then mining, of course, Argentina is unique. It's a federalist system. It's the provinces that dictate the mining laws, not Buenos Aires. So, but that does not preclude the national government from applying some sort of tax. So I think for mining investors, that's what it's going to come down to. I mean, I think you can have a completely gutted economy and runaway inflation and still have a very profitable mine in Argentina. But if the national government, starts to go after the mining sector as a new source of taxation to help it balance it fiscally, then that will be a real problem. And Argentina geologically has, is a great place. It has all this stuff that Chile has, but it's never developed its mining sector quite the same way. And it was starting to under Macri at an accelerated pace. And I think that the Kirchners traditionally, the Peronists traditionally are pro-mining, but out of economic necessity, they may have to go after that one additional golden goose that they have and tax it. And so that's, I think, for investors, you got to watch out for that and try to understand what's going on with the attitudes in Buenos Aires around mining.
Thank you, John. We have a lot more to cover, Colombia, Mexico, the U.S. elections, and also we'll conclude always about opportunities for Canadian companies and Canadian point of view on other openings. But I think it's probably a good time to ask for questions on any of the things that have been discussed now. We went through some, yeah, there is a microphone Marta has coming down. We're trying to keep the questions short and the answers short, please.
Just two quick questions. One is for Jonathan Hausman. You mentioned that in Latin America, the public sector is specifically weak. And just thinking back to U.S. and Latin American relations, and from the Monroe document to specifically Bernie Sanders discussed the events of Chile in 1973, where Salvador Allende was overthrown, and just that America's always had their interests in Latin America over resources, and even when he tried to make mining and such organizations public, they did, Nixon and his friends didn't like that and kind of overthrew the government. So I'm just wondering how that plays a role today, and if this is still a reoccurring issue. And then one for John also. You discussed that in Brazil, they're going to see profits, especially in the in the energy industry. I'm wondering at what expense does that come to the climate and climate change issues, and whether the government even has like any regards towards that.
Thank you. I think on the first question, respect to if I understood the question correctly, U.S. past actions in the hemisphere and how that will play out during the campaign. I think if you don't mind, we'll hold that in abeyance at the moment. We're going to come to that later, and I know Dan particularly wants to talk about that. So if you don't mind, we'll do that. But the other one, John, maybe
About
we'll talk
energy
about energy
and,
and mining
the
in
climate.
Brazil.
So the two things. Obviously, there's been a lot of upset over the expansion of Amazonian fires in the last 6 months in Brazil. That's not a result of the energy sector. That's a result of expanding agricultural production. Now, keep in mind that the level of Amazon fires has grown under Bolsonaro, but is still 40% less than it was under Lula. And the reason is it's got nothing to do with who's in power. It has everything to do with the demand for Brazilian agricultural goods. If you want to blame anyone, blame Donald Trump, because Donald Trump picked a fight with the Chinese. And so the Chinese started buying a lot more soy and a lot more beef from the Brazilians, and that gave the impetus for farmers to go out and burn more forests and expand production. In terms of the energy footprint of Brazil, it is a lot more environment friendly than the Canadian footprint, than the European footprint, than all these wonderful pro-environment countries around the world. They have one of the lowest dependencies on fossil fuels for energy in the world. Why? Because of hydro. And Bolsonaro has just opened up concessions that will triple the amount of non-hydro renewable energy production over the next 6 years. Now, he didn't do this because he's an environmentalist. He did this because he wants growth, and in Brazil, you can actually have solar and wind and biomass without subsidizing it. They don't have to subsidize production in these areas like the way the Germans do or the way that even the Chinese do. In Brazil, the natural elements allow for it to be there's enough scale and there's enough sort of mother nature supporting these industries to make them profitable. And they're getting, I sat down with a guy who runs the fastest growing it's called GD Solar. Used to work at Blackstone, that evil American firm. And he's getting 15% return on investment on his solar projects. And solar is booming in Brazil. So again, I think, look at the facts. Don't listen to what the Globe and Mail is telling you about what's going on in Brazil. The fact is that their energy footprint is very green by global standards. And the Amazonian fires are terrible, but they're not as bad as they were under the leftist government of Brazil. And at the end of the day, it's got nothing to do with politics. It's got everything to do with demands for agricultural production.
Great question. Let's take one more now, and then we're going to push on with the next session of the discussion.
I just wonder what the continent is doing about what people refer to as digital disturbances. Because
I'm sorry, for?
Digital disturbances.
Okay.
And by that I mean the future of creating wealth is manipulating data, not bending metal. And so what is going on in Latin America to adjust to this? Because pretty soon we're not going to need people to do all these things. Robots, AI, and artificial intelligence taking over the world.
Okay, great. We were going to come to that, but let's just go for it now. Go ahead, Eduardo. Latin America and its preparedness for the
I answer that question with what I would say about Mexico. What I worry the most about the AMLO administration, put me exactly on the opposite end of Ocampo, is that Mexico right now is Kodak, and Steve Jobs is about to unleash the iPhone. It's a country that depends very heavily on manufacturing, automation, plus the trend of people spending less and less as a share of their income on goods versus services, would suggest that the country needs a massive revamp of the economy. The good news is that underneath the aggregate data, things are actually looking much better. People like you guys are reconfiguring a country that depends very heavily on oil into renewables, and people are investing in solar, investing in wind power. On the technology side, there's a lot being done on fintechs. There's very interesting fintechs and very different interesting technology firms throughout Latin America. So that Kodak is slowly being reconfigured away. Where I think AMLO gets it completely wrong is that he wants to go back to what Latin America was in the 70s, a state that led things in a certain direction. And that direction is, as you just told me and quietly, more oil, moving. He just announced he's going to create a bank with 2,500 branches, which is about 3 times as many as we have. When we realize that a transaction in a physical branch costs multiples of what it costs digitally, and it's also what used to be, not what will be in the global economy. So we want to be more Kodak rather than less Kodak. What needs to happen for Latin America to move in that direction? Well, first we need stability, because when you have an economy that needs to be reconfigured, you need low interest rates, because low interest rates mean the hurdle rate for investments is lower. So in that regard, that's probably the only thing AMLO has gotten right so far. He has focused on fiscal stability, at least to some degree, which has kept interest rates reasonably low. In that regard, Brazil is doing a fantastic job. You need to have, and then let the private sector allocate resources. You need to get into technology. You need people to move their money towards what is and will be profitable down the line. You need to move towards technology. You need to move towards renewable energies. So in that regard, actually, Mexico is doing exactly the opposite of Brazil. And then concretely to your question, what is Latin America doing? There's a ridiculous amount of good stories of Brazilian fintechs. Mexico now has one of the largest digital growth areas in the developing world, not compared to the emerging one. But that has to come from private sector allocation of resources.
Okay, the door's been open wide to Mexico. Jonathan, go ahead.
Okay. Well, look, I think there's a handy little syllogism that I like, which is the Mexican state is strong where it should be weak, and it's weak where it should be strong. It's strong because it is putting its imprimatur over technocratic processes, which should be technocratic, and becoming more politicized. And it's weak in trying to maintain the longer-term productivity of the country and allocating resources in a way that is probably politically very satisfactory, but ultimately doesn't contribute much to the long-term potential growth rate of the country. And so this is a problem. Now, Mexico also has many reasons why we shouldn't, stay up nights worrying about it, because it's Mexico and it has these sort of structural features, which is one, it's attached to the United States, which rather helps, and it has, as Eduardo said, the residue in a different package clearly, but the residue of a underlying pacto around fiscal, which is they know, and AMLO knows this, I think, inherently, that if they find themselves in a fiscal bind, that the United States is going to kick them around. And they never want to ask the equivalent of Bob Rubin for a check ever again. And I think that holds. And so I also think what holds is that monetarily speaking, and I don't think AMLO can be blamed for too much meddling here, you have one of the most conservative central banks in Latin America, maybe with the exception of Peru, in Latin America, maybe in emerging markets. And so you have this sort of basic stability, but with this other, grotesquerie sort of wrapped around it. So I think that Mexico it's 2020 is underperformance, but I don't see it as critical.
All right, Fiona, Jonathan opened the door to Peru, but I'm going to close it at the moment.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of interest in Canada, obviously, about Mexico, as there is Peru and Colombia, so we're going to get to that right away. But you want to say anything about Mexico?
Yeah, I mean, I think shared that assessment exactly, that it's going to underperform, but it's not a crisis. It's going to sort of struggle along. I think for me, the issue is around what happens when AMLO fails to address voter concerns that brought him to power, because he will fail to address them, because he can't or won't address corruption. He can't address the security issue. He can't address, based on the policies that have been put forward to date, to address the poverty issue, which is unbelievable. Mexico's poverty rate, but not just the rate, the fact that there's been no progress on that. We saw a lot of progress in South America over the course of the commodity boom, and it's been extremely high, and it hasn't moved a bit in Mexico over the course of the past decade, right? So there are a lot of issues. We know that. We know, and we saw, there was that poll a couple of years ago before the election from the Pew Research Center that looked at a series of countries around the world, and support for democracy in Mexico was the lowest of all of the countries surveyed for those reasons, because the problems in Mexico that brought AMLO to power are so big and so hard for any government to address. But also based on the policies that have been put forward so far, we don't see them being addressed. And so there are questions. I think we're trying to guess in our forecast what investors are thinking. And I would guess that investors are going to be concerned about what happens in terms of fiscal policy when that happens, in terms of discretionary, unpredictable policies in the second half of the sessionio. Not to mention the issue around sort of, will he stay, or will he go, or will he try to stay?
Okay, I know you want to. I'm going to actually want to come to you to kick off, and then both of you to talk a bit about Colombia.
I'd love to just
Go ahead.
a little more color on Mexico. I think things are a lot worse in Mexico than we realize, because it's masqueraded by the fact that the external economy of Mexico is booming. I was in Monterrey in April 2017, 4 months after Trump was inaugurated. And there, after a year of anti-Mexico, anti-NAFTA rhetoric, cancellations of new factories in northern Mexico, et cetera, and everyone told me, "Shh, don't tell anyone. Things are booming." Donald Trump is the greatest thing that ever happened to Mexican export economy. He has created more jobs in Mexico's export economy than any Mexican president ever has. Why? 3 things. Number one, his denigrating remarks of Mexico drove the peso down by 12 to 15%, which made it that much more competitive. Also, the fact that he doesn't like immigration, and the fact that the U.S. labor pool has been shrinking for the first time in 200 years over the last 3 years, means that there's not enough young people to hire into U.S. factories. And U.S. factories have not invested in robotics the way Japanese and Germans have, so they need to outsource. Who do they outsource to? Mexico and China. Well, once they started a trade war with China, it meant that Mexico was the only place to outsource to. U.S. companies have been moving production from China to Mexico. Chinese companies have been buying maquilas in Mexico and moving production there to preserve their U.S. clients. Mexican exports are growing, instead of 1% to 2% as they were for the previous decade, at 5% to 10% a year. The export economy of Mexico is booming. And it represents a third of the Mexican economy. So it's growing at 4% to 5%, which means that the internal economy is already in negative numbers. Yes, there's fiscal discipline by AMLO, and yes, the consumer is still buying because he was never over-indebted the way the Brazilians, the Colombians, and Chileans were. But investment by the grupos in Mexico is strongly negative. They have moved billions of dollars outside of Mexico, and it is going to have an impact on employment, and is going to start to impact consumption over the next year or two. So it's not going to be a collapse. It's death by 1,000 cuts, or probably more like 50 cuts. And I say we're about 10 cuts in. So it's going to be a steady decline of the internal economy of Mexico over the next 4 years, while the external economy, as long as the U.S. economy remains strong, will continue to do really well. Which means if your business is focused on exports, fantastic, go for it. If your business is focused on government customers, or the consumer, or even worse, business customers inside Mexico, good luck.
Okay, catch your breath, because I'm going to come back to you. Dan, I want you to talk a little bit about They shook up the room, Todd. This is- I don't people watching
They're all leaving
the
this.
stream
Forget it.
can
I gotta
appreciate
tell.
the din that's going on here after what you just said. Catch your breath for a second. Dan, I want you to talk a little bit about Mexico, but also what's going on in the U.S. with respect to the new NAFTA.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I would say, I mean, if you were to think of one thing in the last year that kind of surpassed expectations, it was the relationship between the United States and Mexico.
Yep.
People were really thinking that between President Trump and the first year of President López Obrador, that things could have really blown up. And in fact, there were a few trembles here and there. But in general, the relationship has been relatively smooth, a few stray tweets aside. And Jonathan talked earlier about how Brazil has never done economic reform at a time of growth. I think the United States Congress is about to do something it hasn't done in 40 years, which is pass a trade agreement in an election year. That's just, trade agreements are typically dealt with in off-year cycles, and now we have the House having passed, as we call it, USMCA. I know it might be TMEC or CUSMA, depending on where people are sitting. And the Senate has already referred it out of its first committee. It has to undergo a few more committee reviews, but probably in the first quarter of this year, we're going to have a ratified NAFTA 2.0 in the form of USMCA, which is a pretty big achievement. Just one other element on Mexico I would add, though. Mexico's had to pay for this in part by really being willing to absorb some of the new and somewhat draconian migration policies of the Trump administration, which includes the Remain in Mexico policy, which means a Central American migrant who transits Mexico and seeks asylum in the United States now has to be returned to Mexico to await their claim. And in fact, there's a growing set of tent cities, in essence, on the southern side of the U.S.-Mexico border. And I think that the level of migrants who ordinarily would have transited into the United States but are now remaining in Mexico for a longer period of time is going to create some social distortion there, certainly in the northern piece.
Fantastic, thank you. Catch your breath, John?
Yeah.
Start us off in Colombia.
Aren't you going to?
Well, no, if you asked me, I would have the same response, like, where do you begin? Okay, go ahead.
So you have a technocrat who never should have been president because he's completely unqualified. Nonetheless, saying all the right things.
Tell us what you really think.
Yeah. I mean, he was a mediocre player in the IDB. If it wasn't for his mentor, he never would have gotten to power. But anyway, he says all the right things in terms of the business community, and they like what he says. And Colombia, frankly, in spite of the way Colombians complain about their politicians, they've had 16 years of pretty good governance, especially when you look around the neighborhood, right? So you've had this tremendous political stability and pretty decent economic stability, in part as a result of that. And so he's inherited that. And so in spite of his incompetencies, things are sort of progressing forward. But whenever he has to use political muscle to try to push forward reforms or, God forbid, even pass a budget, he can't. So I think as long as there's not sort of any great political challenges facing Duque, then things will be fine. And, again, the policies are there that are encouraging of investment, and the infrastructure investments that were lined up under previous administrations, and I think well-designed, they got a second look at by Duque. A couple of them got redesigned, but that's going to move forward. But it's still for miners, and we work a lot with miners, it is a very complicated country. It has the highest rate of project opposition by local communities of any country in Latin America. And this is, again, going back to the FARC negotiations, part of the sort of the agreement that was made was a certain degree of empowerment of local communities, which is a positive thing, but in the absence of the ability to project national rule of law by a central government in Colombia, what it creates is a very fragmented rule of law when it comes to project level sort of support. And so I think for people who invest in businesses in the hinterlands of Colombia, it's still a very problematic place. But if you're investing in sort of road infrastructure, if you're investing in real estate, if you're investing in consumer-facing businesses, we will continue to see growth in Colombia. They took a huge hit in 2015. Industrial production dropped 25% in 1 year. The peso lost 55% of its value. So they're still coming out of that. So Colombians don't feel any richer today than they did 6 years ago, going back to this lost half decade. And that is a problem which is moving politics sort of to an anti-incumbent setting. And we maybe have a leftist government 3 years from now. But I think for the next 3 years, as long as you're not investing in areas where local communities are going to dictate the success of your projects, then Colombia is a good place to be.
Go ahead.
Sure. I mean,
Everybody has something to say about Colombia.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a little more positive on Duque, even though I recognize, he's had a lot of challenges. I think one of them is when he was elected in 2018, in a sense, he was almost rookie of the year, right, in Latin America, that he was a relatively junior senator. He won the election in Colombia with more votes than any other presidential candidate. And of course, it's great to be rookie of the year, but you can't be rookie of the year every year, right? The next year, you're not a rookie anymore, and you're being held to a different standard. In addition, the fact that the Colombians have changed their constitution after Santos, so Duque can't run for re-election, really didn't do him any favors because he's kind of bracketed on one end by his mentor, Uribe, and on the other end by the fact that he's term limited out, which gives him, I think, a pretty short runway and also has diminished to some degree his political capital. That being said, I mean, there has been economic growth in Colombia. The principal challenge for Duque, in my opinion, is and anyone who's seen him give a speech knows that he's an unbelievable speech giver. He gives these TED Talks where the screen reflects different things behind him and matches to his words exactly. But the Colombia that he talks about and that you see on the screen is not the Colombia that exists, or the Colombia that he's governing. And so that's really,
That's just a detail.
It's closing that delta, right? Has been the orange economy and innovation and Davos, fourth industrial revolution centers are wonderful. But at the end of the day, Colombia is still grappling with these very, core issues of peace, of violence, of the justice system and so forth. And then, and I know maybe we've been trying to avoid this, I don't know, but Colombia does border another country known as Venezuela. And there's at least 1.5 million migrants from Venezuela that have entered in Colombia, which poses
2,000 more every day.
And big social challenges. And from the U.S. perspective, one of the issues Colombia has had, it's actually affected every country in the region, but I think in Colombia it's particularly deep, is that the United States likes to talk to countries in Latin America about Venezuela. And Venezuela is a very important issue to address, but Colombia has its own bilateral issues and bilateral concerns with the United States that really get short shrift. And I think that has been a challenge for the Duque administration, just in terms of how they deal with the United States as they see Guaidó and Maduro and that whole situation kind of squeezing out their bilateral agenda.
Well, also how the Trump administration has framed almost exclusively the relationship around the drug issue, right, and the eradication issue, right, in Colombia, which has really had a bit of a distorting effect on politics in Colombia.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I would say that the President Trump keeps coming back to that specific issue, and I think there are others in the administration that are pursuing, I think, a broader approach.
Yeah.
But certainly, whenever Colombia comes to mind, he tends to whack them pretty hard on the drug issue.
Yeah. You all want to say something? John, Fiona, you want to talk a little bit about Colombia?
I mean, I think about Colombia, it's doing okay. We think it's going to grow by about 3% in this year, so which is slightly below consensus, but about, what they will have achieved.
One of the highest in the, except for
it's doing
Peru
pretty
and
well.
South America.
And anecdotally, we think part of that has to do with Venezuela migrants, and they're actually sort of boosting those numbers. So consumption is doing extremely well in Colombia, and that's really supporting the economy. Although, that challenge of migration is substantial on the fiscal side, right? Mm-hmm. And in terms of, social policy. And I think the issue for us is Duque does not seem to be particularly politically savvy or to be able to get things done. So if you look in terms of what's happened in Congress and what legislation has been presented or passed, it's been very little compared with past administrations, right? So Duque needs to get more stuff done. he needs to do a better job, and he also needs to decide where he stands on the political spectrum and how he can get stuff done, and whether that is by aligning with the right or whether that's by moving to the center and by compromising on certain issues that so far, even in the face of public unrest, he's been unwilling to compromise on because of his political base on the right. So that potentially could cause a lot more problems for him in 2020, and we think, that there is a substantial risk of renewed unrest in Colombia for that reason, because Duque won't get that balance right. So it's not that bad of a picture for Colombia, but it's not that good of a picture. And I think what you alluded to was, and meanwhile, while all of this is happening, we see the slow but steady rise of the left. So we think that that's what's coming next, bearing in mind that Duque hasn't, so far the signs are that he won't be the most successful president, right? So the question is, what sort of a left are we going to have? Is it going to be a Fajardo left or a Petro left?
Okay. I'll add my 2 cents now. He did finally have one legislative win with the tax bill.
Yeah.
That it was generally thought to be fairly decent. Certainly the right wing liked it. Their base liked it, and business liked it. The liberals didn't like it, but some of the liberal economists have served. So yeah, there was some stuff in it that made some sense. There's stock answers that I always have about Colombia. One is, and I think this is sort of borne out, despite all of this, it's going to have one of the highest growth rates in the continent, and maybe after Peru at this point. And one of my stock answers always is illustrated by that is Colombia will always succeed in spite of itself. And I think the politics now and the number of things that we're talking about, it's almost Colombians are conspiring to sort of sabotage what could even be a better situation, but because of the qualities of the Colombian people and certain dynamics, they always seem to move ahead. I don't want to say much about Duque. I've written a bit about Duque, but the analogy that I use, I've used more than once, is Duque came to the presidency in Colombia in a very historic moment. And the question was, in my mind, did he actually realize that it was a historic moment? And I don't want to belabor the parallel, but it's a little bit like Andrew Johnson coming to the presidency after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. Now, Santos wasn't assassinated, although there's certainly a good attempt to politically assassinate him quite roundly in Colombia. But the question with Andrew Johnson came, and for those who know a bit about U.S. history, is what's going to happen with Reconstruction? And Andrew Johnson, of course, didn't want Reconstruction, kicked it away, and the United States has been suffering for that ever since. And Duque came to after this peace agreement and what was he going to do for the implementation of the peace agreement? And the fact of the matter is, he had some awful missteps from a number of people's point of view, certainly mine, in either trying to undo it or certainly drag his feet on it. Another issue which is really, and this plays into some of the issue of the dissent in Colombia, which plays out differently than in Chile historically and for a number of reasons, was Colombia, there are still the average of almost one a day this year, social leaders who are being murdered. And these are people who are environmentalists, people who work in communities doing generally good stuff. There's been former FARC soldiers who have laid down their guns, who have been killed because people want to set vendettas. This administration has been very slow in acknowledging. In fact, it happened even before Duque, to credit, and the Santos government was very slow to address it. In fact, some statements were made by the defense minister then were horribly off-tone and incorrect. So it's not just something that happened because of Duque, but it hasn't been addressed. Just the final point I'll make about Colombia is the dissent in Colombia or the national strikes that went on were not, as they were in Chile, sort of a call to the ramparts. And there was not the burning and the destruction. There were some isolated incidents, but the overall collection of people that were involved in the strike in Colombia with students, started with labor unions, but students in a collection, a melange of environmentalists, all the educators, all these people who have the kinds of basic complaints that we have, was always overwhelmingly peaceful. The government, rather than acknowledging it, immediately switched on its fail-safe, which is essentially, well, this is sort of, this is Maduro. These people here are doing Maduro's dirty errand, right? And a complete discounting of the legitimacy of the concerns of the people. They have seemed to have learned on that. I mean, one of the concerns that Colombians would say is we don't want to be another Chile, and the government was almost like, kept saying it was almost like it was going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy by the way they were handling it. It didn't quite happen that way, thank God. There was only one death that's being probed now, but it's fairly clear. It appears from the evidence that there was culpability and overreaction on the side of the police. The question for Colombia going forward is how, and Duque is, how is he going to handle this? He's convoked conversation groups, as it were, a national conversation, when in fact what's really required is dialogue, right? Where, towards solutions. So the question is whether he's trying to buy time or not, and how that's going to play out. Whether this leads to a, quote, leftist candidate, I'm not so sure about that at all. I think actually one of the losers, and this is the similarities between Colombia and Chile, for example, is this is basically a leaderless strike, although, as I say, unions were out front, but there were no overriding leaders and people running ahead of this. So the fact of the matter is, Petro, who's everybody, sort of everybody's iconic leftist that they don't want to become president, actually has seemed insecure about this. And basically, he's a guy who wants to control the street. He didn't control this, right? And so it's a little bit of a rejection of that political class as well. And people who are marching, I knew people who voted for Duque, actually, people who were sort of close to people in the government who actually marched because they're upset. They're not voting leftist. The other, and many of the other people voting leftist as well. Fajardo, it's unclear whether he's it's unclear what is a centrist. He would seem to be a guy, but even Fajardo, it's not clear that he's the natural heir to any of these votes on the street. So it's completely up in the air. I would not foresee if all of a sudden investors got upset thinking about, my God, in 3 years we're going to see who knows what coming in Colombia, that I don't see that happening at all. Assuming that the government isn't completely ham-fisted in handling the dissent now. But I don't see that prognosis as one might see it for some of the other countries. Let's talk a little bit about the United States. Let's go to Peru. Let's go to Peru, and then I want to come and talk about the U.S. election in Latin America. John, Eduardo, do you want to talk about Peru?
Sure. I guess for me, Peru is the most similar thing to northern Italy that exists in Latin America. It's a country that works despite the politics. I think Peru had the foresight to do a lot of reforms very early on. And I think the most important thing they did is that when they created the pension system, they forced a very high mandatory contribution in there. And that anchors everything. If you look at Peruvian interest rates for a country with its income per capita, they're absurdly low. And that comes back, they accumulate savings so fast that there's just too money flowing in to buy. A government is being very fiscally prudent, so there's no money being gobbled up by the government compared to how much is being accumulated, which means they just have a very high investment rate that's structural. If you look at the historic investment rates in, say, the polar opposites, Brazil versus Peru, there's a 7 percentage point difference over the past 20 years. And I think that comes back to two very smart decisions being taken very, very early on. And that in turn means there's a lot of capital flowing around the economy. So the economy, you can have, today we have every single former president that's alive in jail. You have a Congress that's going to people dismissed early, and the country functions fine. I think Peru, in a way, it's no news is good news. Well, in Peru, it's almost the opposite. There's lots of news, but we still have good news because you just have created this structural bonanza. So the politics you have a country with no political parties. You have a country that has you could argue, the most political instability of any functional country in Latin America, and yet there's no problems. So in a way, it's the most boring country to talk about.
It wasn't that boring in September.
Yeah,
actually, when Vizcarra dissolved Congress, scheduled elections in 2 weeks from now, and actually the CCA will be doing a teleconference on the very, very important congressional elections coming up on January 26th. Fiona, it's an interesting story in Peru because President Vizcarra took a hard stand on the anti-corruption measures, and lo and behold, had the support of 80% of the people, or some such. What can we glean from that, and how Peru and Vizcarra handled, or is apparently handling, the anti-corruption file? Because that's clearly an issue that everybody has throughout the region.
I think it might be something that's difficult to replicate in other countries, because you have this situation where you have this interim president who is popular, and all of the public anger is directed at the Congress, whereas you would see in most other countries in the region that it's widespread, and you see presidents that are extremely unpopular. So that would be the difficulty of trying to manage a similar process outside of Peru. But I would just say for Peru, I want to say that we're super positive on Peru. It's where we expect to see the fastest growth rates looking out into the medium term of all of like the Latin America, the LAC 6. So all of the substantially sized economies we're expecting. This year it'll be over 3 after a really poor year last year that was trade related, which suggests that there are some, external risks to our forecast. But we're projecting growth of over 4% in Peru, which is sort of miles better than anywhere else, particularly among, the larger sized economies in Latin America. And what Vizcarra has done, and one of the reasons we're so positive, is he's coming in, he's not sort of trying to maneuver for re-election. And he has this golden opportunity. The growth outlook is pretty good, and he's got this really great reform agenda. So that in our view, is this historic opportunity to produce much faster growth rates in Peru than we've already seen, and to make progress in areas that we were talking about at the very beginning, where we'll see difficulties in other countries, but we see, that Vizcarra is looking to make much more progress on infrastructure, and because they have, the better financing capacity. And for example, we do something called an infrascope, where we assess the PPP frameworks of all of the countries in Latin America, which we've done for the IDB. And Peru keeps improving, and now it's got the second best PPP framework in Latin America, and it's also done some sort of some new things in terms of trying to get institutional investment. So it looks as if it's going to have a lot more investment in infrastructure. It's looking at more access to credit. It's looking at skills. So there's the economic diversification to try to reduce sort of vulnerability to the external sector, to weakness in the likes of US and China. So what Vizcarra is doing in terms of his policy program looks great, and we expect to see sort of a more friendly Congress coming out of the election in January, so that will be vital. So we think that he can get a fair chunk of that done. I think looking out longer term, that's still going to be a weakness in Peru like it is elsewhere in Latin America, that the Congress is still going to be very fragmented. We don't see strong party structures. We don't necessarily know what's going to come in the next presidential election because that leads to the rise of outsiders. So there are some question marks there. And finally, a question mark would be around, for the mining sector in particular, we still see, the potential for unrest on the part of indigenous communities. So that will continue to be a complication. But that said, we're very positive on Peru, and we think it's got really good prospects based on what's happening with Vizcarra.
Great, thank you. We have a few minutes left. I want to turn to the U.S. if panelists will let me, unless someone has a vital thing to say about Peru. Dan, you recently wrote, it may have been on Match.com, I can't remember, but it said, U.S. Secretary of State Pompeo's recently unveiled mantra of realism and restraint in Latin America suggests the United States will take a backseat in the region, especially as Washington's political battles intensify ahead of the 2020 election. Latin Americans will find no such then you make a Star Wars analysis. The Empire Strikes Back Skywalker is ultimately rescued by his friends. Latin Americans will find no such option in the United States.
I think that from the beginning of the Trump administration, is really viewed, most foreign policy, but Latin America policy in particular, as purely an outgrowth of U.S. domestic politics, right? And so there wasn't really a vision to try to engage the region, to approach regional issues. And so what things really boiled down to was the NAFTA renegotiation, border issues with Mexico and Central America, Venezuela, and then Cuba and Nicaragua a little bit, because that was a Florida electoral play. And that's about it. And I found it actually fascinating that Secretary of State Pompeo wanted to give a speech on Latin America policy that focused on realism and restraint, because in fact, the impression in the region is quite the opposite, that the administration's been bombastic and loud and in some cases punitive towards countries where it didn't have good relations. But I think that, at this particular juncture, and this piece, I believe, was written even before the recent events in Iran and Iraq, which is obviously consuming so much foreign policy bandwidth of the U.S. administration right now. And so that's really where the emphasis is going to be on some of these big global foreign policy issues, China trade war, you could add to that, and perhaps a couple of others. And then, the U.S. domestic political scene. So if you kind of narrow scope the administration's vision down to those areas, Brazil vanishes, Argentina vanishes, most of South America goes away with the exception of Venezuela. Cuba, somewhat relevant in Florida, although I would argue it's becoming less and less so. And then clearly these issues of NAFTA renegotiation, stopping immigration, and building the wall on the U.S.-Mexico border. And that's going to be the focus of the Trump administration for the next 10 months at least.
Okay, I'm going to go to Jonathan, but I'm going to actually give you a chance to address what Jonathan said earlier, that Donald Trump was going to win the election this year. I think Jonathan said that.
I did say that.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know it.
Yeah,
I
okay.
did say
So,
it.
you've obviously worked and still work closely with Vice President Biden. Just came back from Iowa. What's the argument? And what would be your argument, and I know you make it, that the best thing for Latin America, and therefore theoretically liberal democracy and engagement, North America and Latin America, would be Vice President Biden?
I'm here just in my personal capacity, obviously. I would say.
Yeah, but I have the brochure, the flyer. You brought this back from Iowa, so.
I would say in terms of President Trump, will President Trump be reelected? There's a lot of prognostication on both sides of that equation. One thing that's clear is that if any U.S. president could lose reelection with a booming economy and 3.5% unemployment, it's President Trump. Right, that there has been, I think, such a strong lack of approval for him. His disapproval ratings have been very high throughout his tenure, and so there's a vulnerability there. And then for those who know the U.S. Electoral system, it really boils down to our electoral college in a few states. And so, can the Democrats put forward a candidate who's capable of winning Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Florida? And if the answer is yes, then that Democratic candidate is very likely to be the next president of the United States. Now, there have been studies of the Electoral College. I believe that President Trump lost the popular vote in 2016, around 3 million votes or so. There have been studies that have been done that say that he could lose the popular vote by as many as 5 million votes and still win the Electoral College. Because if a Democrat runs up big margins in New York and California and other states, and Trump narrowly wins in a few key electoral college states, then that would be possible. And I think that there's still a lot of unpredictability in the race, as was mentioned. I was just in Iowa. There were two big polls that came out recently in Iowa. One that had a three-way tie for first, with, I believe it was Elizabeth Warren, who was in the second place, and another, which is essentially a three-way tie for second, with Bernie Sanders in the lead. And 40% of Iowans
Feels the burn.
are still undecided about who they're going to vote for. I had an opportunity to interact with many of these undecided Iowans, and it's unbelievable to me as someone who lives in the District of Columbia and doesn't even have a congressional representation to be undecided at this point. But I think you're going to see a lot of movement in the polls over the next several weeks And it's still TBD in which direction.
Okay, great. I thank you. And Jonathan, I know you want to say something, but the clap reminded me that there's still a question that we held in abeyance, which is through the presidential election, how does the U.S. past actions, I suppose, in Latin America, how do those get played out, or how might it be the best?
Could I address
who might
that?
be the best interest
Yep.
for the U.S. to elect vis-a-vis their relationships in Latin
So
America?
maybe
Go
I
ahead,
can take
Jonathan.
that.
Yeah.
It was directed to me originally.
Yeah.
I waited very patiently. So two, very good question, and two key points. So I think we have to place that question in the context of, and by the way, this is not necessarily related to who becomes president. I think this is the key point, of where the U.S. is in the global system back in the 70s versus today, or pick your decade, 80s. And it's very different. And it's very different. I mean, the same questions are being asked, I'm sure, in Taiwan and in Japan and in Korea. The question is it America as the hegemon leading a series of global norms and global institutions to maintain a liberal order, or is it America first, consumed by know-nothingness and self-interest? And I think we have seen a grotesque example of that with the erratic application of this under the Trump administration, but I don't think it's a Trump phenomenon. It was actually more of an Obama phenomenon if you think about the activities that were not taken in the face of challenges to the global norms and the global system in the Obama administration. Arguably, it started with Bush, with Georgia. So I think that the answer to your question is that the Monroe Doctrine is kind of it's an artifact and a menagerie of American political history in Latin America, which I don't think really applies today. And I don't think it will apply specifically to any administration in the United States because it has become very domestically oriented. It is very focused upon its own sort of navel gazing, and it's a big country in a world that is fragmenting into blocks. And the natural question is, well, the block is the Americas, right? It's all the Americas. Well, I don't think it is. I think Mexico might be the exception to the rule, actually, sort of grudgingly, because it's attached, and there's so much of this, just as John described, this sort of the overflow economic effect in Mexico, as there is in Poland, say, related to Germany, for much the same reason, in my opinion. So that's the first point. So I think that this is a structural secular trend away from the America really meddling because it's really not in its interest to do so. It's not trying to protect anything. It's not trying to protect the world from communism. It's just trying to protect it so that it can consume and enjoy the fruits of living in a big autarkic country. The second point I want to make is that there are big costs to that for Latin America. Very big costs. Because that creates a vacuum. And that vacuum is increasingly filled by China and to a lesser degree Russia. And in both cases, you have the same phenomenon that can grow up in Latin America as has grown up in, say, Africa or parts of Asia, where you become subsumed into sort of the neo-mercantilist Belt and Road world that is an entirely different economic system that is designed to maintain control, but without any influence or any kind of positive, notion of what that economic relationship is in terms of political ramifications for global peace and harmony and developing, Latin American countries as democracies. Quite the opposite, I would argue. And it is dead set on providing huge amounts of benefit short term and lots of burden long term in terms of the debts that are created, the tit for tat that then follows in terms of negotiations between governments, and people are just not part of it. Latin Americans at least have in large part, have been engaged in a process. Now, they may not have liked all the meddling from the United States, and arguably much of it was very malign, but the result of that was a much broader, much more diverse political life. That's not the model that China follows. They're not interested in what the people have to say. They make a deal. You pay me. I'll give you a bridge. Oh, you didn't pay for the bridge? Here, your debt to GDP is now 400% of GDP, which happened in at least one country in the world so far as a result in Africa. So that's the problem. In terms of Russia, just very quickly, universal prankster, don't really have an agenda, just want to push the United States' nose as much as it can, tweak its nose, sort of Three Stooges style. And, you know, it will do so by supporting candidates in various countries.
That would
where-
make Donald Trump curly? Is that how that was?
I would not criticize the United States president, but what I will tell you is that you know is the same phenomenon as you see in Eastern Europe, the same phenomenon you see elsewhere. It's undermining to the degree that Latin America has made this huge step in the 70s and 80s. You know, Guillermo O'Donnell and the whole deal. It's not a good prognosis if that vacuum grows.
I really want to end on that note, and particularly because it's 10:05, but and I know there's a lot more to be said about China particularly, and a few other issues we didn't get to, but I think it was a tour de force among the panel, as much as we could cover, certainly in the major jurisdiction and some of the important leitmotifs going on. But before I close, I would ask if anybody has questions. If not, with that, then let me thank the panel very much. Thank you for attending. Thank you for all of those who've watched the live stream throughout the hemisphere. And we will see you at other CCA events in the very near future throughout the year. And please keep continuing to check ccacanada.com or the Twitter @CCA Canada for all the new and coming events that we'll be doing. Thank you again for attending. Thank you, panel.